Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia. Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. Ciao everyone and welcome to episode 18 of Voices of Italy Beyond la Dolce Vita. On this podcast, we often unpack the cliches of a romanticized Italy, the land of amazing food, ancient ruins, and passionate people. But even in podcast perfect Italy, there are things that us Italians aren't exactly famous for, like, for example, our civic sense. We're known for being chaotic drivers, also, deadlines and punctuality aren't considered our strength, and the picture of our reputation usually also includes a healthy dose of political corruption and mafia. And truth to be told, Italians are often the first to criticize themselves. We see other countries, especially like Germany, Switzerland, or Denmark, and we automatically say they do things right, they make things work. They follow rules, implying that that's not exactly what we do at our home. So, what if I told you that Italy is actually one of the top recyclers in Europe? Yes, Italy, the country where trash scandals make headlines, illegal landfills still exist, and cigarette butts basically decorate every sidewalk. How can all of this be true at the same time? In this episode, we talk about the contradictions and the truth behind Italy's Green Revolution, and we talk about how Italians often are their own worst critics. Today's topic really represents one of the deepest reasons why I started Voices of Italy. And I know that so far in the intro, I've basically just talked about garbage and recycling and how Italians are not exactly known for doing that kind of thing right. But follow me here. I really care about telling you about authentic Italy, and that sometimes implies talking about the most ordinary things that you can think about, because the whole point of this podcast is bring you over here in Italy and make you feel and tell you about how it feels to be Italian today. That's what I started to think about when I was scrolling my feed on Instagram and I saw this graph showing that Italy ranks extremely well in the EU for recycling and waste separation, what we call raccolta differenziata. And my instinctive reaction there was, what? Really? It really doesn't sound like us. It's like when you have that cousin in your family that, maybe is good looking, but doesn't go so well with school. And all of a sudden you find out that, I don't know, he got this big promotion and he's doing this big thing in his life and you're surprised. That's a little bit how I felt. And why is because, like many Italians, I've grown up internalizing this belief that we are somehow less efficient or less civic minded than other countries, especially compared to the mythical North, like Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, where the trash bins are always clean, everything is coded, people actually stop at street lights, pay their taxes, everything works really well. And it's really a common belief among Italians that we're just not that. That's the assumption. I think it's really common that we have this idea about ourselves and that there's this gap with other countries. And the fact that the waste management sector in Italy is notoriously associated with corruption and mafia really doesn't help improving that opinion, especially if you grew up in the South like me. And, it's almost a given that when we talk about garbage, organized crime is involved. I remember when raccolta differenziata became mandatory by law, and there was this time where every region in Italy was kind of starting implementing this system because it falls under their jurisdiction. And I was younger, of course, so it was more hearing adults talking about it, and the talk was very pessimistic. It was really like, this is just for show. They're probably gonna keep doing what they do, or they're simply not gonna be efficient, or people are just not gonna do it. Like there was zero trust in the system. Again, I come from a small town in Sicily, definitely not the most privileged area in this country. So I'm not saying that that's how everybody felt in that kind of occasion, but that's definitely not an uncommon kind of opinion to find. And another kind of problem that I normally associate with the idea of garbage as a person that grew up in South Italy is people's behavior around it. I grew up taking for granted that people are not socially responsible from that point of view unless you force them to be. Unfortunately, that's a reality for many people in South Italy, but just to tell you that really it's a concept, of course, that may seem ordinary, thinking about garbage and its disposal, but I think it's one of those sector in public administration that tends to tell a lot about how things work in a country, and this is definitely the case for Italy. So when I saw that chart, my brain, yeah, started to remember all those times where other Italians that I know were saying stuff like, we will all start sorting our trash properly, but in the end they always throw it all together anyway, so it doesn't matter. Like that sort of assumption that you kind of take for granted that that's probably what's happening most of the time. It might seem exaggerated, but yeah, it's really, really, really common to hear. Not only people that think that that's what happened, but also the people say, I saw it happening. I saw the garbage truck like pulling everything, throwing everything in one big container, taking from different bins with different type of waste. So and it's not something that necessarily surprise people, unfortunately, and that's kind of what people were feeling at the beginning when raccolta differenziata became the new system. That's kind of what people were already anticipating happening. And I mean, let's not lie, of course, Italians tend to be very, very self critical. So this could be very much a cynical misconception, let's say, but there's definitely a real problem behind it because we're not just pessimistic to our bones for no reason. Definitely, us Italians are too hard on ourselves, but at the same time, there are a lot of things that we complain a lot about, even though maybe we're at times part of the problem. And of course, this is not just about waste management. It's obviously a broader kind of topic, but I really, really thought that this example and the developments related to raccolta differenziata really make for a perfect example of how Italy works and of some problems that you might not necessarily know, but that really, really have an impact on everyday life here in Italy. So let's start with some facts. Italy sometimes really surprises us. I was researching for this episode and fell in this data rabbit hole, and there's really a lot to consider. You can't just pull a couple of numbers and have a clear idea of how things are handled in a country, of course, but there's definitely some things that can give you a partial picture. In this case, I looked up some data of an institution called ISPRA. It's the Istituto Superiore per la Protezione e la Ricerca Ambientale, so all about environmental protection. And in its latest report on urban waste, Italy recycled over 83% of its total waste in 2022. That includes both municipal and special waste. What essentially that means is that it's not just the garbage from our kitchens. It also includes stuff from industry, construction, agriculture, this kind of sectors. Now, if you look at the EU average, according to Eurostat, is around 53%. This means that we're not just doing a little better, we're doing 30% better than other countries, including Germany, that we all assume is the model of efficiency in every regard, and they are doing around 70%. Same for France, that is around 64%, and Spain around the 50%. So Italy with that 83% and higher, it's really a big gap. It's one of those unexpected kind of data, but it doesn't stop there. I looked up at something called the circular material use rate, which is basically how much of the material we consume comes from recycling instead of virgin raw materials. And it's very, very much of an important recycling KPI. From Eurostat, the EU average is 11.5%, with Germany at 33%, France at 17%, and then we have Italy with a super solid 20%. But I could really mention a couple more of these. Why does this matter? Because for a country where we constantly complain about how nothing works and we just say that everything is a mess when it comes to public administration, these numbers are actually a reminder that something is working, but somehow we just don't know about it. We just don't know where we do good. And it's sometimes one of those really funny things about Italy, that even Italians are sometimes victims of those cliches and those stereotypes, that we start seeing ourselves in those instead of looking at how we're really doing. And no, of course, I'm not saying that we're suddenly an eco utopia where everything is great and we don't realize it. But this does mean that structurally we have systems in place, private and public, that in theory are supposed to be working, given that this is the result, even if our daily experience sometimes tells us something different. But, and here comes the but, this is obviously not the full story. This is when my train of thoughts kind of took a very Italian direction and started to think that behind such great data on paper, the reality behind is probably messier and involves at least a little bit of corruption, and that whatever the situation really is partially distorting this data. It must be. You see, Italy has a very well known, at least for us, it is very well known problem with the mafia and other criminal groups controlling sectors of the economy where essentially they can make big profits with little oversight. And again, corruption there is the key element, like it or not. And guess what? Waste management is one of their favorite playgrounds. That's really something that notoriously they are involved in. But let me break it down for you, because I understand that it might seem obvious from a certain point of view and not so obvious when you think about, yeah, mafia, what they might actually be involved in. So let me break it down for you. One of the most infamous cases of environmental crime in Italy is the so-called Terra dei Fuochi, so land of fires. This is an area located in the Campania region nearby Naples, between the cities of Acerra, Nola, and Marigliano. Why is this called the land of fires? Because for decades, toxic and industrial waste has been dumped illegally and then burned in basically open air fires, releasing, as you can imagine, very dangerous chemicals into the air, soil, and water. These fires have often been visible from afar. It's not something that was exactly conceived, and became a symbol of environmental devastation because obviously of the huge consequences of this case. Behind this whole situation is the Camorra, which is one of Italy's oldest and most dangerous criminal groups, which infiltrated the waste disposal sector starting already in the 1980s and 1990s. They have been making billions by illegally disposing of special hazardous waste, often from industrial companies in northern Italy and even abroad, who found it cheaper to hand it over to criminals rather than following legal procedures. But this is obviously not just bad for the environment. This is a public health disaster. A 2016 study by the Italian National Health Institute, the Istituto Superiore di Sanità, found unusually high rates of certain cancers, birth defects, and respiratory diseases in that specific area. And in 2017, even the European Court of Human Rights condemned Italy for failing to protect its citizen in that region, stating that the government had not monitored or cleaned up the contaminated land. And you can imagine this is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of mafia. It's obviously easier to think about just Godfather style kind of people, but especially if you grew up in South Italy, this is mafia. This is something that affects people's life every day negatively, like a poison, like something toxic that unfortunately is part of the system. According to a 2021 update from Legambiente, which is basically the environmental watchdog NGO in Italy, there are over 2,000 illegal waste dumping sites identified in Campania alone. Italy is not, as you know, a huge country. So imagine what this means. Some of them have been active for decades. Legambiente, by the way, is also one of Italy's largest and most respected environmental associations. We're not talking about data that comes really from any entity. And they have been known especially for something that is called Ecomafia report, which is a detailed analysis of environmental crimes in Italy based on data from law enforcement, prosecution, other institutions. And so their work is obviously very, very crucial. But obviously, this is not exactly just a Calabria based problem, not at all. Another shocking case, for example, involves Ndrangheta instead, which is another criminal group based in Calabria, still in southern Italy. Multiple investigations have essentially suggested that this group has been involved in the illegal disposal of radioactive and toxic waste. Yes, radioactive. They sank entire ships full of hazardous materials off the coast of Calabria or trafficked this waste abroad to places with weak environmental laws. In this kind of cases, the most dramatic problem is that there are a lot of things that are controversial and hard to prove. So it takes always a long time to even verify what's happening and who's involved. And obviously, this increases the long term risk of contamination. It's something that has an impact that is absolutely tragic. Now, it's just not about obviously rogue operations dumping waste behind closed doors. These criminal groups control the industry in entire areas, and they win waste management contracts through intimidation, corruption, creating fake companies, and then obviously they get huge public money with this kind of operations. And you would think you get, all this money by poisoning people. Essentially, you might at least do the minimum work that is necessary to do, but no, at times they fail to actually recycle or dispose of the waste safely, like at all. So they are entire areas where all this is like just a huge disaster. To give you a scale, according to the Ecomafia report that is by Legambiente that we were mentioning in 2023, the illegal environmental economy in Italy was worth something like 8.8 billions in 2022. That includes illegal construction, poaching, pollution, especially waste trafficking. There's over 30,000 environmental crimes that were reported in that year alone. And Camorra, 'Ndrangheta, Cosa Nostra are the most heavily involved, but there are also smaller groups that are active, locally, depending on the area, I imagine, depending on the jurisdiction. And there is this word that I have been mentioning and that I have been taking for granted, but researching it, I then realized that it's actually an Italian neologism. So this whole system in Italy has its own name. It's Ecomafia, and it's a term that started to be used in the 90s to describe exactly the intersection of organized crime and environmental destruction. And this just helps maybe a little bit to explain why many Italians are very skeptical about good news when it comes to, for example, the example of the recycling rates, because we know that the system isn't always that clean and the numbers that come from the system might not be that reliable. And unfortunately, my home region, Sicily, it's definitely not exempt from this kind of issues and contradictions. Take, for example, the case of Palermo. Just outside the city, there is this Bello Lampo landfill, which made pretty big headlines back in 2013 when a massive fire broke out. The air filled with toxic smoke. People were really told to stay indoors. And what came out later was even worse because the entire waste system had been mismanaged for years with mafia linked companies running everything behind the scenes. In general, unfortunately, Sicily is pretty consistent in not performing well when it comes to environmental crime. And it's not just waste. There are, for example, illegal buildings going in protected coastal areas, fake wind energy companies exploiting green activities and incentives, and according to mafia informants, even hazardous and radioactive waste trafficked through Sicilian ports or dumped at the sea. It sounds like a bunch of conspiracy and, big crime theory, but these claims have been part of multiple investigations. And obviously, again, you never get the full picture. There's definitely a lot going on there. Let's leave aside the big crimes and mafia groups. I think what it's very dramatic is how it affects people's mentality and state of mind, and also how it affects their sense of responsibility towards the community, because this kind of situations going on for so long, affecting people's lives, and honestly not being cracked down by the government, like being left there, makes people feel hopeless, makes people feel like their contribution is not important, is not going to make a difference, and that tends to really affect people. It's the same reason why Italians, a lot of Italians, do not exercise their right to vote. They don't believe that it can make a difference, and they don't realize that by not going, they become part of the problem because they increase the number of people that don't go, and it's this vicious circle. Like in this case, I grew up with a lot of self-hate when it comes to Sicily, and I'm very sorry to say that because I grew out of it. I completely understand why I used to feel that way and why people still feel that way. Again, I think it's very natural when you grew up in an area where you feel like nobody cares about the basic needs that people have there where you live, and you don't think that the state cares enough, even if there's death and desolation and corruption around you. So again, it makes you feel like what you do doesn't make it worse, doesn't make it better. You're just doing what everybody else does. I think it's easy comfort for a lot of people. And so that turns into complacency. But definitely, I think not feeling supported by institutions is definitely a huge incentive for this kind of behavior. And I think the best example that I can give you here is, since we're talking about garbage, in the area where I grew up, I am absolutely used to see piles of garbage bags in just streets where you usually drive from a town to another, and just seeing garbage people that dumped maybe a washer or their old bed. And I grew up thinking that that was the norm, that there's just less civilized people that behave that way. And I was very angry at them because it was like you're dumping stuff in your own house, in your own home. We all live here, and maybe I don't like that I share it with you, but you walk here, you live here, you breathe here just as much as I do. So I just couldn't understand why they would do something like that. And when obviously I started to grow up and see more places, starting from North Italy, the first place I mean Central Italy, the first place I visited the first time I traveled outside Sicily was Florence. And it was for me like seeing another world, things where, compared to what I'm used to, things where clean and orderly, everything is pretty, everything is taken care of. That's how it felt taken care of, and that's what I wasn't feeling when I was back home. And I'm sorry because it may sound in this case like a stereotypical picture, but for me that was reality. It doesn't correspond to reality of the whole Sicily, obviously, and I want to be very clear about that, but I don't think it helps anyone if we don't admit that, yeah, in this case, we have a bigger problem than other regions have, and that's just undeniable. And what is more painful is to see people's contribution to that situation. So, not just the big criminals, not just the big bad state, people every day contributing with their little bag of trash because of their own selfish feelings, or because they just don't want to contribute, because again they just don't care, they just don't feel like it matters. But um you know it kind of changes you to see that people do that to their own home. And of course, enforcement is not easy. Mafia and other crime groups really are deeply rooted in some region, and corruption can sometimes slow down investigation, obviously, or weaken punishments, or simply make those entire areas become invisible in the eyes of the state. Everything that I've been telling you so far may reasonably sound like an emergency, like something extremely important, but it might surprise to hear that is definitely not the top priority of any political agenda at any point in Italy. But again, the issue isn't uniform across the country. The North tends to have more effective systems and less mafia interference than the South, but definitely they're not exempt. Organized crime is simply, again, more embedded in everyday life in the South, but it definitely affects the entire country. But the growing public awareness and pressure on authorities to act more for, green ideologies, I think is having an impact, because people fighting for those ideals. And this indirectly encompasses a little bit this, so at least that's a positive point. And yet, we talked about the what we're doing good. We talked about what we're definitely doing bad and why. We talked about mafia and organized crime and what it really means when you talk about environmental crimes and you put corruption and organized crime in the picture. But I think, if we're talking about this topic and we're talking civic sense and system failure, I think we need to be honest. We might do very well separating waste and reading the little icons on packaging, rinsing yogurt cups, etc. But on the other hand, there's an objectively, I think, low attention really in everyday life when it comes to the environment. It's like people care a lot about the label. They care about buying something that maybe, was recycled, and or they like to say that something that they bought is secondhand. But unfortunately, I still see on an everyday basis, a little bit of behavioral problems. A symbol that I think I consider probably the most representative of what I'm trying to tell you, and it's cigarette butts. For me, really is the item that tells you how much we really care about the environment, because you see even commonly people just flicking the cigarette on the ground, just throwing it away, no shame, no hesitation. It's really one of those behaviors that when my boyfriend first moved here in Italy, he saw it and he was asking me, like, is this normal? Like, I see this person confidently throwing it away in the street, even in plain sight, even with, no matter in what area you were. This is not necessarily, talking about maybe gentrified or not areas, really here in the city center where everything is supposed to be a little more taken care of. People do that commonly, really daylight. It's a perfectly accepted behavior. And it always drives me crazy. Especially when it happens when there's maybe a trash bin 2 steps away. And so this really tells you people do not even think of that as something that you need to bother about tossing in a bin. They just toss it in the street. And again, at the beach, even just there in the nature. Yes, I've seen it and I've seen people doing it and I've seen the result of people doing it. They're really everywhere. Going back to Legambiente and its report in 2023, almost 30% of the litter found on Italian beaches is cigarette filters. We have a lot of smokers, that's true, but we have a lot of very, very naughty smokers as well. These filters are not biodegradable. They contain arsenic, nicotine, and they leak into water and soil. So, we do recycling really well, but we casually pollute in public spaces. Another thing in this regard that might surprise you when you come to Italy for the first time, or if you're not used to live here, is pet waste. Yes, a lot of poop in public areas. It's, I think, just a known issue in various Italian cities. And it's one of those cases where sometimes small towns can do a little better or a little worse, depending on the area as well. But in big cities, for sure, it is an issue. And when it comes to big cities, there's really no north-south gap. I lived in Palermo several years and now in Turin several years, and it's a disgustingly common problem in the streets of both cities. Some towns have implemented measures to address the problem. Like in Bolzano, they introduced like a mandatory DNA testing for dogs to identify the owners who fail to clean up after their pets. I would like that to be honestly the national kind of system. I don't care. It's too common. Just yesterday, we were just taking our little passeggiata here in the city center of Turin. And one of my favorite spots here is a gallery called the Galleria San Federico. Is in the very city center, and it's absolutely beautiful. It just feels that elegant vibe that is typical of Turin, and it's a place that it's commonly very, very clean and well maintained. Yesterday, even there, I saw this little dog poop. It was so annoying. It let me think even more about making this episode, because really people are shameless, really, really shameless in this regard many times.
But let's wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it made you think a little bit about the beautiful contradiction that modern Italian identity is. And let me know your thoughts and your experiences here in Italy. You can reach out, as always, sending me a message on Instagram at Voices of Italy, or a voice message, both on Instagram or through SpeakPipe. And make sure to follow the podcast and leave a review. It really, really helps Voices of Italy. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.
For this episode, I've got something really meaningful to recommend. Check out Libera Terra. It's a network of cooperatives that work on lands confiscated from the Mafia. They produce amazing organic food like wine, pasta, and olive oil, but more importantly, they create jobs, dignity, and a different narrative for southern Italy. You can support them even if you're not in Italy, because many of Their products are available online. Head over to liberaterra.it to learn more and see what you can buy from their website from wherever you are. It's a small gesture, but it can support justice, transparency, and people's lives. Thank you.